有请论坛司仪、中美交流基金会特约主编周柳建成先生。
Please give a warm welcome to the host, Editor at Large, China-U.S. Exchange Foundation.
Hello, I'm James Chow, and thank you for joining us here today. It is 8:30 a.m. in Beijing and 7:30 p.m. on the US East Coast. And you're watching Beyond Differences Towards Cooperation, the theme of this year's Hong Kong Forum on US-China Relations, which is co-hosted by the China-U.S. Exchange Foundation and the China Center for International Economic Exchanges. We're very delighted that you could be with us here today. These two organizations are chaired by Mr. Tung Chi-hua in Hong Kong and Mr. Zeng Peiyan in Beijing. Over the next 3 days, we'll be looking at a whole host of issues, including global supply chains, trade and investment, climate change, the recovery of the global economy, and also the types of everyday interactions between people that will help impact opportunities going forward when we look at these two countries. We've held this conference in different formats over the years, physically, hybrid, and today completely virtually. So we're welcoming everybody who's joining us here online. We're going to be joined shortly by former leaders from Ireland, Canada, Singapore, Japan, and also China. But it gives me great pleasure to welcome first to welcome us officially, Dr. Victor Fung, who is here in Hong Kong. He'll be speaking in his capacity as Vice Chair of the China-U.S. Exchange Foundation. Dr. Fung, as I think all of us here know, has made very rich contributions to different facets of public life, but of course he's very well known as a leader of private sector here in Hong Kong, but also internationally. He studied at MIT, he's taught at the Harvard Business School, and he's been with his family business since 1976. Dr. Fung, may we ask you to welcome us here today, please?
Thank you, James. Mr. Tong, Mr. Zhang, Excellencies, distinguished speakers, ladies and gentlemen, good morning and good evening. On behalf of the China-U.S. Exchange Foundation and our co-host, the China Center for International Economic Exchange, it is my great honor and pleasure to welcome you to this third Hong Kong Forum and US-China relations. It is really great to see so many familiar faces on Zoom. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm speaking in place of Mr. Tong, who really wanted to be here. Along with deep apologies, CH sends warm greetings to his many friends around the world. I'm sure he is eagerly following our proceedings by Zoom. We all hope that by this time next year, the pandemic will finally have subsided and we shall meet again in person and hopefully here in Hong Kong. Over the next 3 days, we shall be joined online by more than 30 eminent speakers and many more participants across 7 time zones. A big thank you to all of you who are staying up late in the US and even later in Europe. Year by year, our aim at this forum is to have a thoughtful dialogue on the state of relations between the US and China, the single most important bilateral relationship in the world. With the help of world leaders and experts, we like to explore this relationship through a global as well as a bilateral lens. We all recognize that this bilateral relationship is not played out in isolation. It is vital to understand and assess its impact on the rest of the world. Our theme this year is Beyond Differences Towards Cooperation. We shall explore it from many multiple angles: global economic recovery, trade and investment, global supply chains, cooperation on climate, and people-to-people cultural exchanges. 1 year into the Biden administration, significant differences and disagreements remain between the US and China. During the previous administration, the framework for conducting the relationship was fundamentally changed. There are questions over what will happen next with trade between the US and China following last month's expiry of the Phase 1 trade deal. While it's widely reported that relations between the two remain tense, or frankly, are even deteriorating around certain high-profile issues, it is very relevant to note that the two economies remain highly interdependent. Trade and investment data underscores this reality. In 2020, China was America's largest goods trading partner, third largest export market, and the largest source of imports. Exports to China supported an estimated 1.2 million jobs in the US in 2019. Recent surveys indicate that American companies remain committed to the China market over the long term and count China amongst the top 5 priorities in the global strategy of their companies. Of course, at the same time, the US still is China's largest export market. Another positive is that the predictions of a decoupling between the US and Chinese economies appear to be really premature. We have indeed seen shifts in the long-established trade patterns in recent years. But in my experience, this has been far more to do with digital technology than decoupling. And of course, transportation issues related to the pandemic have by far been the greater cause of disruptions to global supply chains. Trade flows would have been even stronger had it not been for these bottlenecks. It is encouraging to see meetings also taking place between senior Chinese officials and American business leaders. China has recently acted upon the visa concerns of US businesses by upgrading fast-track entry for executives and their dependents. Now, these are small moves, but they're significant. And of course, there are many other green shoots as well. The leaders of both nations are communicating in earnest and are addressing substantive issues. In my mind, the tone of high-level exchanges has markedly improved. Last month, the US and China cooperated in a rare joint pledge by the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council to reject nuclear war and avoid arms races. In November, the US and China signed the joint Glasgow Declaration on enhancing climate action in the 2020s. Personally, I can think of no more urgent and important task for the people of the world. The Glasgow Declaration, in my mind, is an absolute victory for multilateral thinking. Looking ahead, we can expect a flurry of media coverage around the 50th anniversary of President Nixon's visit to China in February of 1972. Of course, that took place in the Cold War era of US superpowers' rivalry with the then Soviet Union. But I believe we can still draw insights from what President Nixon described as the week that changed the world. In the declassified US transcript of this historic meeting between him and Chairman Mao, President Nixon says, and I quote, "What brings us together is a recognition of a new situation in the world. We can find common ground, despite our differences, to build a world structure in which both can be safe to develop in our own way and our own roads." Today, the world again faces new situations and new challenges. In addition to the all-important climate issue, if, as a businessman, I'm asked to identify the 2 other priorities for cooperation between the US and China, they are economic recovery from the pandemic and the upgrading of the multilateral system for sustainable trade and investment flow. I would really like to offer 2 propositions for this forum's consideration and perhaps one personal observation. First, to accelerate global economic recovery, I strongly believe it is time for the trade war between the US and China to be placed in abeyance. With inflation increasing in the US and with the growth of China's domestic consumption slowing, I'm sure the will must be there on both sides. The pandemic has utterly changed the global economic landscape in which punitive tariffs and sanctions were first imposed on China in the mid-2018. And in an interdependent world, all nations are, of course, affected when the two largest economies are at odds. Continuing the trade war will, in my view, only be an impediment to restoring the full economic health of both nations and to maintaining economic stability at a global level, given the scale of devastation wreaked by the pandemic. Hopefully, going forward, the US and China will work to resolve their trade issues in really more constructive ways. Second, the US and China have a golden opportunity to lead much needed efforts to upgrade the multilateral system for trade and investment. Having been conceived some 75 years ago, it must be made fit for purpose in the age of digital commerce, climate concerns, pandemics, and inclusivity. Along these lines, a global dialogue is already underway to revitalize the World Trade Organization. This is welcome, but such a huge task cannot be left to Geneva alone. Here in the Asia Pacific, two mega trade areas are taking shape, which together cover roughly 1/3 of the world's population and 1/3 of global GDP and trade. They are the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the RCEP, which came into force on 1st of January of this year, and the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CPTPP, which came into force 3 years ago. These two groupings have numerous overlapping members. China is the lead player in RCEP and has applied to join the CPTPP. The US, as you know, is in neither at the moment, having given up its early leadership of the CPTPP's forerunner. What if the US and China were now to work together to combine the two? For sure, it would take time to reconcile differences in the approach to each bloc, perhaps with a reformed WTO facilitating that process. But the outcome would be far greater, in my mind, than some of its parts. I believe it could form the basis for a new multilateral system, better able to serve the changing nature and needs of trade and investment for the next 75 years and beyond. To close, the observation I wish to share is prompted by President Nixon's remarks to Chairman Mao about nations developing in their own way on their own roads. Companies today face ever-increasing complexity when they do business in both the US and in China. Many find themselves under intense pressure to make a choice or risk falling foul of government policies and regulators. For most businesses, it is not desirable or even viable to make such a choice. So many decades after the US-China economic interactions were first encouraged. Moreover, by operating across boundaries, companies deliver value and generate wealth for shareholders and other stakeholders in their respective countries. They have certainly helped to keep e-commerce going for consumers around the world during the pandemic. In my view, therefore, the principle multinational businesses should follow when operating in any country is that of rigorously observing local laws. Where differences and contradictions arise in understanding each other's laws and systems, I further believe that these are best addressed through multilateral channels. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, as I leave you with these few thoughts, I wish this forum every success. We can anticipate many valuable insights and robust discussion, and I'm really very excited to have all of you participate. And thank you all again for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fung, for not only sharing your important thoughts, which we'll begin to unpack and discuss and build solutions through these 3 days, but also for speaking on behalf of Mr. Tong here today, and as such, helping to lead this conference forward.